Okay, here we are. This is Jay Brown Yoga Talks podcast. My name is Jay Brown, and apparently life is still happening. The world has not completely collapsed as of yet, apparently, although we may be on our way there. That's an awful, cynical way to start this off. Forgive me, I didn't mean to do that. First, I would really just want to welcome anybody who's new and thank everybody who's returning for doing so. But it has started to feel more strained, hasn't it? I don't know where you are, but there's talk of reopening, but I'm not so sure. It is certainly starting to feel much more like a marathon than a sprint. And the question that everyone seems to be having, at least it's the conversation I've been having all week with my fellow yoga teachers. Everyone's just sort of timidly wondering, is anybody starting in-person classes again? And it almost seems like asking the question means that you're okay with people dying, which I'm not suggesting that we should start teaching classes again. It's just depending on where you live. Like where I live, they're starting to do this phased reopening. And some of the early, steps are groups 10 or under with spacing. So theoretically, by the law, you were permitted to, but is anybody feeling comfortable to do that right now? Are we going to have small classes and space them? Are we teaching and practicing in masks? Nobody knows how to answer that question. And some people are just saying, no, we just have to wait it out for longer. And then, frankly, I canceled one. I postponed another one until September. But that's still like a guessing game, right? Who knows? I'm really feeling a lot of grief. And I'm not ready to accept that I'm not going to be in the room with other people, that I'm not going to be able to hug people. I'm not ready to accept it yet. Maybe I'm in denial, I don't know. I'm just not ready. I'm not ready to accept that we're just going to do these online classes only. And maybe I guess that's what we're doing for now, but can't be forever. Can't be. Sorry. Oh gosh, it's so... there's just nothing to be said about it right now. It's just kind of a wait and see still. Waiting to see now that some places are reopening. Are there going to be these big surges? You see, some people saying, yes, it's time. We've bent the curve. But as far as I understood it, bending the curve did not mean we weren't going to get it. It just meant not too many people getting it all at once and overwhelming our services. Nobody said staying at home meant you weren't ever going to get it. It just, it's like, and then people are saying, oh, well, look at previous pandemics and the second wave, right? The second wave is still supposed to come, supposedly. So there's all that fear, And people are always saying, oh, conspiracy theorists, and then the science. Well, hey, look, I don't know shit about shit, and I'm just looking at everything that's coming my way, and I can find contradictory information from reputable sources on both sides. So it's just not clear. We don't know. And it takes time to come to discoveries. And so right now, where we are right now, there's not a lot of clear answers. And I guess there's just a playing it safe. And I guess that makes sense to some degree. But what are we going to do? What else are we going to do? We're going to do the best we can. That's what we're going to do. Let's try to keep it together, I suppose. That's what I'm trying to do. Still having very fruitful practice with people, and finding ways to really make the technology work for me rather than against me. If you were listening last week, I had Derek Sivers on. I totally implemented a bunch of that stuff, just trying to relate to my digital dealings with clarity. And setting boundaries and working within those boundaries. Anybody who's practiced with me know that's the whole thing I'm teaching. So really, taking what I do in my practice rituals and putting that into real, actual behaviors and attitudes is kind of the best thing I know to do right now. Fortunately, today's guest is Nick Danu. And Nick is someone I have been corresponding with for a few years now. We've never met in person, but she listened to the podcast and she reached out to me, and we've just been comparing notes over the years. She's another DIY type who has a punk rock heart, and we just sort of communed even just through email exchanges over the years. And right now, with everything was going on, I had the yoga center owners on. I wanted to reach out to some fellow teachers and find out, what's been going on. And it occurred to me that Nick might be the perfect person to talk about, what was happening up until this happened and what we're looking at right now. And I think I was right about that. So I'm very happy to be sharing that with you today. Real quick before we do, let me say something to any of you who are yoga studio owners or managers who are really in a bit of a spot and trying to figure out what to do right now. How are you handling things? Is your studio management software working for you or against you right now? And if it's the latter, then maybe now is the right time to check out today's sponsor, KarmaSoft. Longtime listeners have heard me talk about KarmaSoft before. They are our longest standing sponsor, and it is the studio management software that I used when I had my center in Brooklyn. Rudy Senecal, the owner of KarmaSoft, has been on the show before, and I encourage people to go back and listen to that episode. You can hear us talk about the company and why I thought so highly of it. I just think that Rudy's the kind of person that you want to have on your side right now. He's worked out a number of different options for how people might be able to get through this. So now might be the time to reevaluate and reassess. You can go check it out for yourself and see. Go to karmasoftonline.com. Also, this episode is brought to you in support from Podcast Premium subscribers Beverly Martin and Elena Gregane. Thank you so much, Beverly and Elena. We are so grateful to our Podcast Premium subscribers. Not only does a Podcast Premium subscription give you full access to the archives, but it is the best way to help support this show. So thank you so much to everyone who's doing that, and to Beverly and Elena. We deeply appreciate that kind of support. Okay, I think that's good. Is there anything else? No, there's nothing else. Let's just let that be it. I will touch base with you on the other side. But for now, let's go ahead and get to this. Let's listen to this conversation I had with Nick Danu. Hello?
Hey, Jay, can you hear me?
I can. Hi, Nick.
How's it going?
Pretty good, I guess. I just had to do like a grocery store visit.
Oh. Is that intense?
It kind of is. I mean, it's not as bad as it was like the last time I went a few weeks ago. It has sort of like there's new measures and everything's calmed down some, but it is like it's a major project in a way that it never was before.
Truth.
Yeah. In any case, hi, it's cool that we're talking because I feel like we've been exchanging emails for years.
Yeah, a few years, I think.
And I always think of you as a like mind and maybe even of the same tribe in the sense that you seem to retain some punk rock, like hardcore roots to you.
I sure do.
You do more than I did. Like I have that kind of bit of heart and root too, but I keep it a little bit more on the down low, but I've tried to always have a little bit of rock and roll in my yoga. And I remember when I opened my yoga center in Brooklyn and I was having like a logo done, I was like, it can't be black. It has to be a color. I was like, it's got to be a dark, rich purple. And it just seemed like that's a color that you, right?
Awesome. I did a teacher training yesterday, and at the end on Zoom, and I was asking if anybody had any last questions before we wrapped it up. And one of the girls said, okay, other than purple, what's your favorite color?
Right.
And I was like, actually, my favorite color is black, but there's some debate as to whether or not that's actually a color. So we'll go with purple.
Well, since I've been exchanging emails with you, it's always felt like you were another DIY person who was finding your way through, and we've always been swapping notes. So it's great that I'm actually getting to talk to you after all these years.
Yeah, it's great. You're recording already, probably, I'm assuming.
I am. You listen
I
to
know
the
you.
show.
I listen.
Well, the other thing is I just recorded a couple of conversations that are posting out. One of them posted out today, another one posted out next week. And this one will probably post out a little bit sooner than it might normally, because sometimes there's like a big space in between. But these other conversations were with yoga center owners.
Gotcha.
And some of it was catch up, but some of it was like, okay, what are you doing right now? How are you handling it? And frankly, they were both like more inspirational stories of yoga centers kind of doing an okay job of handling it in a sense.
Oh,
or
good.
Like, yeah. And I was like kind of grateful to hear it, but I know there's other things going on out there. And even when I brought up to them how before the pandemic came about, how I saw that there was like a considerable downturn for a lot of centers across the country, just in terms of regular numbers, whether it was classes, going from like 50 people to 25 people, or yoga teacher trainings going from 30 to 15. So I guess I'm curious, even before we get to what's been happening here with the pandemic, to go a little bit back before then and touch base and compare some notes. Did you see downturns? Like where were you teaching before all this happened?
It's hard to say without not strolling too far back down memory lane. So I moved to the city I'm living in right now, which is Victoria, British Columbia, on Vancouver Island, about 4 years ago. And previous to that, I had all my own classes that I ran myself. And so those classes were super well attended and always had a wait list. I did registered series, not drop-in classes. So people signed up for 6-8 weeks, whatever at a time. It started with smaller numbers like 6 and 8. And by the end, I was doing 12-week sessions. And that was just because the students kept saying, why do I have to keep signing up? Like, can't I just pay you for a whole year? And I was like, well, maybe not a whole year, but we could probably do longer sessions. So my frame of reference for even what the yoga world was like, or what it was like to be a yoga teacher, was pretty different, because I ran all my own classes. I promoted them myself. I registered everybody myself. I rented the space. I bought the props. And then 4 years ago, I moved to this little enchanted island, this magical little city, and was going to school full time. So some people in their midlife crisis buy a sports car. I decided to give up my whole life, move to an island, and go back to school. And I was studying traditional Chinese medicine and yoga therapy, sometimes separately, sometimes all at the same time. And so I was not running any of my own classes, because there's just no way with that course load that I could even do that. Plus I was a nobody here, meaning like nobody knew who I was yet. And I wasn't really established at all. So I started applying at studios and, gradually worked my way into what's a pretty cliquey scene here.
Wait a second. Before we get to the clicky scene, I want to go back for a second.
Yeah.
You may have said it. I might have missed it. So before you moved to Victoria, where were you?
Oh, sorry. I didn't say it. I was in Calgary, Alberta.
Okay.
Which, for those of you who are Americans, Alberta is right above sort of Wyoming and Montana.
Okay.
So right down from the Rocky Mountains.
Okay. And so when you were doing those classes that you mentioned in Calgary and you were running your own show, how did you get to that? Like,
okay,
that's not like, you know what I mean? Because that's not
common.
It's an unconventional path. And I've talked about how I've gotten to it through the New York scene. And I'm just curious, in Calgary, what was it like? Was there lots of centers? Was there not lots of centers when you started? It looks like we kind of started around the same time. I saw like 1997 or somewhere in there for you, something like that. So what was it like?
So I actually went to my very first class in 98. That was me attending my first class. And as you mentioned, I do have a bit of an edge to me. And I had zero interest in yoga, like none. Because the only yoga that I had ever seen was that PBS special. You know, where she was it? Is it Lilius? Yes, Lilius.
It was her with her. So desperately to get Lilius on this show.
Well,
and
maybe
she almost did, and then she didn't. And then I don't know if anybody out there is listening. If Lilius is listening, please, Lilius. So many people experience.
Yes, Lilius, come on the show.
In any
so
case,
she was my only reference for yoga.
Yeah,
just was watching that, and you know, as a ex-heavy metal kind of punk rock kid, that was definitely not something that sold it to me. Yeah. And so I had zero desire to go to yoga at all, but I was a hairstylist back then and a hair educator as well, platform artist. And so one of my colleagues said, oh, we should all go to a yoga class on a Monday morning. Monday's typically a hairdresser's day off. That'll be so fun. We should all go together. I looked at her and I was like, did you just say morning on my day off? Like, how is that a fun thing to do? And, she kept at me and finally promised door-to-door service and lattes if I would come to this yoga class with the whole group. So I said, okay, fine. And we went to the class, and this was 98, and I fell in love immediately. Like I was like right after that class, I said to them, I'm going to do yoga forever. Like I was just completely hooked.
And can you identify for yourself in retrospect, what do you think it was about it?
Yeah. I mean, now I can. At the time, I just knew that I felt really calm and really centered. And like I kept saying, it felt like I was walking on clouds as I left. But now I know, you know, being older and more mature and having studied some yoga therapy and been in some therapy, that I've actually had anxiety my whole life. I just didn't know that that's what it was. I just thought I was kind of prone to worry, but I didn't realize that because I had been that way, like literally since birth, I didn't realize that that's actually what it was. I thought that everybody kind of was like that to some extent. And I think that that was the first time that I probably really deeply dropped into my parasympathetic nervous system and had my brain shut down and just focus on yoga, which was obviously pretty powerful. Mm-hmm. So I kept coming. They all kind of moved on and picked up other hobbies, and I kept going to yoga. And, you know, I took a break here and there, convincing myself I could just practice at home, and I would practice the 4 poses I remembered at home, and then I'd go back. And at that time, all of the classes where I lived were registered. There was no drop-in yoga.
It was like a teacher doing like a sign-in sheet and register for so many classes.
Yeah, like you'd sign up for 8 weeks or 6 weeks, and that was just the way it was done.
Right.
And it never really occurred to anybody, I don't think, for many years for it to be any other way.
And drop-in stuff, right? Just
no, drop-in is bad for business. It's bad for the yoga. We can get to that, but yeah, it's bad for the yoga. So yeah, I kept doing 6-8 week series, and I had, then tried a couple other teachers, and I did that for a few years. And then slowly the yoga started having its way with me. And I just decided I was doing hair for a living, and I had a lot of work related injuries and was starting to have to work less, and was spending a whole bunch of money on chiropractors and massage. And it became kind of, I was getting the inkling I should come up with a plan B at some point. Mm-hmm. And then I had a yoga teacher a hairdresser friend who developed an allergy to hair color overnight and had to retire like immediately. Mm-hmm. And that really startled me because I was a hair color expert, and that's what I did. I also traveled around the country and was on stage with mics and models and all that whole hair show stuff. And it really hit me that like, if something happened, I didn't have a plan B. And as hairstylists, typically you're self-employed. So it's not like I could have just gone and gotten unemployment or something. So it really kind of hit me that like a plan B would be a good thing. And I had been spending more and more time going to yoga, and I'd always been a bit of a closet Buddhist too. Like I was always reading Buddhist books. And I mean, I wasn't studying with a teacher, and I didn't, have a sangha because I was a bit of a lone wolf. But I had been reading a lot for years and had been trying to, start meditating, and it just kind of slowly worked its way in. And I started becoming less and less satisfied at the salon. I still loved being on the road, and I loved doing shows because those were very creative. It's basically like creating art on heads. It was pretty awesome. But then, I'd go back to the salon and it would be the same boring.
Yeah, people complaining and like printing in the photo, wanting you to make them look like that.
Everyone wanting the Jennifer Aniston haircut,
I was just thinking about like my hair guy, and he's got back issues, and I'm always like, listen, man, let me help you out. And I did have to give myself a haircut a couple weeks ago, and I didn't.
Oh, I'm about to do one myself.
I didn't do a terrible job, but I value somebody else doing it for me. I have learned, I have observed and watched and learned how it is interesting how hair, you can achieve a lot of the same results in a lot of different ways. Like people cut different ways. I had one guy who would do like the same exact ritual, the same every time, kind of like the way I like to practice. And then I had this guy, he does the same thing, but he doesn't know he's doing it in the same order. You know what I mean? He's like, depends on how he's feeling. And sometimes he starts here, sometimes he starts there, Interesting.
Keeps it fresh for himself, probably.
I guess. But what I think it's funny is that you were saying that you needed a backup plan, but you chose yoga as your backup plan?
Here's the thing. I know, right? But I had already been self-employed, so it wasn't really that. As a hairstylist, I'd been self-employed since I graduated high school when I finished my apprenticeship. So it wasn't that unusual for me to think about forging ahead and doing something on my own.
Yeah.
Here is the thing, is that doing hair all those years spoiled me because I got to do something I loved every day. And so I was sitting with it and literally meditating on it and was like, okay, well, what else do I love? Like if I needed a plan B, I don't want to just get some gig that I'm going to hate.
You're not going to get an office job.
No, I don't think I'm really cut out for that. Not sure they'd hire me.
But that's kind of where I'm going, because it seems like for you, the same. When you first started going to yoga and thinking about yoga at this time, it was still a very counterculture move.
Oh, yeah.
So being punk rock and getting into hair makes perfect sense. And then if you were like a kind of punk rocky person like myself, and then at a certain point after a few years, you're like, oh man, this isn't going to last forever. You're like looking for an alternative direction. Yoga was still a counterculture way, and it was like healthy. It was like feeling better. But it was still punk rock. It's still punk rock.
But it wasn't. It was in that it was uncommon, and counterculture. But if you were to look around at the examples of people practicing yoga, there was nobody that represented what I looked like.
That's true. It was still very traditional, and the gurus.
And a lot of kind of, older women. And so, I basically sat down and just was saying to myself, what do you love to do? What could you just do and you love it? And only two things came up other than hair. Well, other than, going to gigs and maybe tattoo conventions, but you don't get paid for those. So, and that was, I love reading, but since I didn't see anybody paying me to read mass amounts of books, that clearly wasn't an option. And then the other thing was I loved yoga. And I thought, well, I'm already a teacher. I'm already teaching hair. It's I'm already comfortable in front of groups. I already know how to talk to different learning styles. I know how to break things down and explain them. And I love yoga. So it just kind of hit me. It was well, that would probably be smart. Teaching yoga. That way you still get to teach what you love, and you get to teach something you love, and you don't have to have a job that you hate. And that makes sense. So I sought out a teacher training. And interestingly enough, you interviewed Rob Walker.
Yeah.
He was the director of my first teacher training.
Oh, wow. How about that? That's cool.
And he is very different now than he was back then, let me tell you.
I bet he was. He said so himself. That's why he wrote this book about how much things have changed. Yeah, that's very interesting. So you knew him back when? Yeah.
I knew him when he was still, preaching the Iyengar Bible.
I see. Because I was going to ask you, because I know that you and I have both gone in this therapeutic direction. And I guess I'm curious, did it start there for you, or did you
No.
Pick a hardcore type of yoga to go with or like a aggressive type of yoga to go with. And I guess Iyengar was pretty like hardcore at that time because it was like kind of kick you in your ass kind of style.
Yeah, I mean, there was only, in Calgary at the time, there was really only offering teacher trainings. One was a place called the Yoga Center, which is actually where I had been practicing and studying. And I was considering their program. And I'm glad I didn't go with it because they actually closed 2 months later once I started. Like they just opened a bigger place too quick and they couldn't keep up and they closed. So good thing I didn't sign up with them. And then the other studio was an Ashtanga studio. And those kinds of styles have never worked well for me because I already have a tendency to not be grounded and anxious, and just kind of moving that quickly. It just actually makes it worse for me. I need to so although I might be attracted to it especially because I was also an ex-bodybuilder. So in some ways I was attracted to like the sweaty physicality of it. I would not feel better after. I would feel less grounded.
That's interesting. Does listening to like hardcore music make you anxious or calm you down?
Neither. Yeah.
At a different time in my life, it was actually very like, I don't know, it felt like an outlet or something.
Yeah, I could say it definitely was that for me. I think now when I listen to it, it's interesting because right before I went on with you, there's somebody on Facebook just made this meme of 80s aerobics to a Rob Zombie song, and it is brilliant. It's so funny. Yeah. So I was watching it, and I couldn't help but get up and move because I was like, oh my gosh, Rob Zombie, So now when I listen to that, which I listen to I actually have always listened to a really diverse group of music. Like there's very little music that I don't like. Like I like something from pretty much every genre, but they do tend to be a bit of the obscure things in each genre, or a little bit more hardcore within the genre, I guess you could say. So no, now when I listen to music like that, it's usually because actually I want a little energy.
Interesting.
It'll give me a little energy, it's a good thing to kind of,
right.
I'm feeling a bit foggy in the brain, or like I need to get up and move, or I need some motivation.
Yeah.
That tends to be when I'll listen to it.
Interesting. Cool. All right. So then you go to do this teacher training. Which one did you pick?
So I went to Rob's, which was the yoga. At the time, it was called the Yoga Studio. Then later, they changed that to the Yoga College. By the time that I had graduated, it had a new name.
Right, Yoga College of Canada. I wrote down.
I believe, yeah. And so the reason I chose that is because I had met with Rob, and I actually went through with another friend who was a hairstylist. I kind of convinced her that she should do this with me. I liked how organized the program was. And I liked that there was a huge diversity. Like there was a lot of teachers. It wasn't just one teacher. Mm-hmm. It wasn't. And so I really liked that because I wanted to get kind of a diverse perspective, I guess you could say. Now, that being said, even though it wasn't an Iyengar certification program, because we all know that takes like a gazillion years, it was taught by 99.9% Iyengar certified teachers. So in its essence, it was an Iyengar program. Everything we learned was from the Iyengar tradition, other than some things like we had some, meditation workshops and things as well. But all of the asana and the way it was presented was very, very Iyengar. And so and it was a 300-hour, because they did 200-hour spread out, I believe, over a year. Feels like it was so long ago, it's hard to remember, over a year. And then while we were in that, we did 25 hours of what they called assisting and observing, where we basically were just hanging out with the teacher at the front of the room, and we were their gopher. We got to ask them questions after. And then 75 hours of apprenticeship. So that was my first teacher training. Mm-hmm. And I finished that in 2004 and started looking for teaching gigs. And
is that when you started doing your own classes? Is that what you're talking about?
I mean, pretty quickly. I had so I had a couple that were where I was contracted in, but they were still kind of unusual. So I did go initially to yoga studios, and I would ask them questions like, "Okay, so what do you cap your classes at?" And they would look at me and go, "Cap?" And then I'd say, "Okay, so when you pay your teachers, it's an hourly rate. And is there like a difference if there's 20 people versus 45? And they were like, no. And I was like, that doesn't seem right. It's just like, I'm picturing myself in this room teaching 45 students, and it's the same as if I was teaching 20. This doesn't make sense to me.
Well, that's really interesting to me because salons often do have, I don't know, ones you were teaching it, but I remember a friend of mine who opened up a little salon right around when I opened up my yoga center. And, like the stylists would basically kind of, I guess, pay for their chair. Like you rent your chair and then you kind of keep everything in a way, or like,
yeah, I mean, that's one model.
There was a cut that also, I don't remember the exact details, but I remember it was a little bit more like the stylist had a more independent status.
Exactly. And so typically in the hair industry, it is that chair rental or commission.
Right.
But either way, you're self-employed and you make your own hours and you market yourself. And so just looking at it when I went into these studios, I guess maybe because I had that prior background of being a hairstylist and being self-employed, that I was like, this doesn't seem like a very good deal for the teacher. Mm-mm. Like I was just like, you could be teaching 45 people and running around like a chicken with your head cut off. And like, you're making the same as somebody who's got 20 students. It just didn't click for me. And so I didn't end up working in any traditional studios to start. I did get hired on at a gym, and this wasn't like I don't even like to use the word gym because it was so different. It was kind of like a high-end fitness center. And so they had a separate room for the yoga where you actually didn't even have to, well, for all their fitness classes, but I, of course, only cared about the yoga, where you didn't even have to go through the club to get into the space. And so I started with them, and they immediately started with registered series. That was just like, it was like not even though they were a gym, it was like the classes were registered. So that was one of the first places I started teaching. And then I had one other, I didn't initially think I was going to run all my own classes. It just kept falling in my lap that way. I had another gym downtown that I had taken over a therapeutic class, a back pain class, for a friend who thought she was moving away. And so I had taken over that class. And that, again, was a gym, but it was a pre-registered class. So it was 6 weeks at a time, and people signed up, and it was over the lunch hour. And with that one, so how I started running my own classes was, there was two things that kind of started it. With the one that was downtown, the gym actually closed because their rent got hiked up. And I was, just a fairly new teacher and thought, okay, well, there goes that class. Guess I better look for something else to fill my Monday 12 o'clock class, And the students were like, well, no, what about our class? Like, what's going to happen to our class? And I was like, what do you mean? It's like, we're done, and they were like, well, can't we just keep doing it? And I just sat with it and was like, well, can't we just keep doing it? I don't know. And I said, you know what, give me the summer, beginning of summer. Cause it was like May-ish. I said, I'll look around. I'll put my head to this and I'll see what we can figure out. And I just literally went walking around downtown and was like, is there anywhere here where I could rent space? And then we could run the classes just like they were before. And so I walked around and I found a beautiful old United church. And I just walked into their office and said, I'm just wondering if you rent out space. And she said, yeah. And I said, I'm looking for a lunch hour time. And she's like, we have one room Thursdays at lunch starting up in September. And I was like, I'll take it. And that was that. So I registered that handful of students. They brought friends and coworkers. That ended up turning into 2 classes a week that were always full with a wait list. We had to move into a bigger room.
And in 2005, 2006, what are we talking? Like the internet was just starting. Was it emails yet, or what? How was it?
It was pretty much like, it was pretty low tech, honestly. Like, I had a website, and did I even have a website? No, I had email, but I don't think my website was up yet.
Yeah, those were just barely.
It was old school. It was like printed out registration forms attaching checks. Like,
yes, I had like the punch cards. I had punch cards and stuff sometimes. Like,
yeah. So I had my waiver and I had the class policies form, and they'd fill it out and put their information, and then they'd give me a check or cash, and then they'd have their spot.
Yes.
Years later, of course, I got a little fancier, but that was the way it was then. And that class filled. I added another. It filled. They always had a wait list. Then there was another neighborhood where, again, I was hired to work out of a chiropractor's office. She had a yoga space. Then she decided she didn't want to run yoga anymore. Wanted to have a spa in there instead. And again, here I am with a handful of students in this neighborhood where there's no yoga. Yeah. And I'm like, well, maybe I'll just go see if there's another church I can rent. So that's what I did.
And it also makes sense again. It also makes sense again to me too, because I know, just going back to like your previous experience preparing you for being able to do this stuff, because I know stylists, it's kind of the same deal when they have like clients, you get attached to the people who cut your hair.
Yeah.
And so I remember like one of the people who used to cut my hair, like kind of fell out with the owner of the salon and left and like sent us an email. And it was kind of like, oh, a little on the down low, but you know what I mean? Like,
yeah. That's happened to me a few times.
But my idea is that, so kind of like having a list of clientele or is not dissimilar. And that translates out to having, like you said, it's just a handful of people who you could be in contact with who want to do yoga with you. And that ends up like a ball rolling so that you end up having a class for like years.
Yeah, because as a hairstylist, you only make the mistake of not keeping your own client records once. because if you leave a salon, and even the ones that say, oh, we'll let people know where you are, and they don't do that. So I learned that the hard way the first time after, being at one salon for 5 years and leaving and going, legally, I had to legally have my own records because I couldn't take their records or it would be considered theft. So I got really good at just like, hey, what's your name, your email, and just kind of keeping up with it. No, I didn't have like a MailChimp account or anything yet. I wasn't fancy. I just had my Gmail.
Right.
But I had little groups and I grouped them according to what location they took classes at. And that was just kind of how I started. Mm-hmm. So what ended up happening was the two were running downtown. The other neighborhood where she closed, I found a church and I just set up, this is so hilariously old school. I knew that there was no yoga in the community and I knew that nobody in the neighborhood knew me. And so I put a little ad in the neighborhood newsletter saying there was a free info night about yoga classes starting in the future. And I made a big thing of tea and I had yoga books and I set up a table and I sat down with some paper forms and some pens and people came and the first class filled immediately.
Nice.
That first one I did 2 for 1 and I did that intentionally so that I could double the bodies in the room. Mm-hmm. So even though for that first session, I didn't make a lot of money, I knew I was getting twice as many people in there for that 8 weeks or 6 weeks. I think it was 7, the first one I did. Than I would have otherwise. And so that first class filled immediately. I added another one to start 15 minutes later on the same time. So I ended up having 2 back to back and those both filled. And 7 weeks later, they were full again. And
boom,
10 years later, I had 10 classes in that neighborhood and some of the same people for like 10 years.
See, that was how you did it. But I love it because you just kept it like old school like that. I got eyes for like the way the industry went. It was like, I need to have a center and like a brand or whatever. Like,
yeah. Well, I mean, it's not like I've never considered opening a center or a studio.
Yeah.
COVID.
That was what everybody did. That was the model. That was what, that would be the next step, especially if you were selling them out,
Yeah. I mean, for me, I think I always knew that, like, I know my strengths and my skill sets. And I always knew that there's no way I would open a center unless like an accountant wanted to be my partner.
See, you're smart. You're real smart.
I know my strengths, like hustling, marketing the classes, showing up, being present, all of that stuff. Yes. Bookkeeping, no, not so great at. So I would only have ever done it with a partner. And I really essentially was running my own show. I was just subletting space.
Right. You were renting your chair or whatever.
Yeah. And I didn't have to, if I didn't run a series, like over the summer, I would drastically cut them down. I didn't have to pay for that rent when I wasn't using it. So
your overhead could modulate with your income.
And so that's gradually how it started. And then by the end, it got to the point where I left the first gym that I started teaching at because of course, the yoga is my priority, and I just got so sick of convincing them that we needed some extra props like yoga blankets in a freezing cold room, and like, why do I have to put all these space heaters on? And, you know, like it just started getting to the point where like the yoga was suffering, but not because of me. And so again, because I already had these other classes running and I was now familiar with like, now you just find a church and you rent the space and you put up posters, it was like, well, I can do that again. And so I found another United Church. United churches are great for renting. If any yoga teachers are listening, they're very open-minded.
Yeah.
And so I found another space and, you know, put another 2 classes. And yeah, by the end it was 10 classes a week and I was running them all. And essentially that allowed me to double my income without the students paying more than what they had been paying before.
Exactly. Well, I so hear that. And then, okay, so you're doing that for a while, and that's before you move, or does that? Because then
That's
you
all
move.
before I moved.
Why do you move, or do you get to Yin Yoga before or after you move?
I got to Yin Yoga before.
Okay, because I see here you did a training with Paul Griley in 2011, or you did some training with him?
Yeah, it's when I did my first teacher training. I did some workshops with him in 2007. So if we rewind back to my newly graduated Iyengar influenced 300 hour, I'm a new budding teacher. And the 2 things that I was not feeling confident on after that training were my anatomy knowledge, which I think probably every teacher says after their first teacher training. And I was a little bit blurry on sequencing. And so I started...
Because Iyengar wasn't so much about sequencing. It was like these 4 poses or themed like shoulders and stuff.
Yeah, I mean, they have sequences, but the rules are different too.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, it was just a little bit vague. Like, why did you put that warrior before this warrior? Like, I just didn't feel like I had a good handle on it. And so I started, you know, doing some more self-study in that regard. And then I also started doing I was looking for more anatomy studies. And so I was in a bookstore, you know, back when we still had those. And I was in the yoga section and I saw this DVD that said Anatomy for Yoga. I didn't even know anything about it. I was just like, well, that's got me as a new teacher. Anatomy for Yoga. Done. I bought it. And I started watching it. And it was Paul Grilly's DVD. And it completely changed the way that I looked at bodies and my own body. Because there was so many things in Iyengar yoga that I would ask them, because their cues would be the opposite experience in my body. And I would ask them about it. And I'd say, when you say, it's like, that doesn't make sense in my body. And I would never get a good answer. For example,
Guruji said.
in extended side angle, for example, if I bring my hand to the floor, I get a sharp pinching in the flesh of my hip.
Me too.
But if I bring my hand to a block, I'm okay. But then I'm not really feeling a stretch. I'm just kind of hanging out there. And so I was asking them, like, well, what can I do about this? And I was told it was because I had tight hips.
And if your hips weren't tight, you could put it on the floor and you wouldn't have the pinch.
I wouldn't have the pinch, which is ridiculous because I can fall asleep in a pigeon pose. Like, it's not tight hips, you know? And so I knew back then even, I was like, that is not what is actually happening.
Yes.
And so there was just some things I never got answers to. And when I watched that DVD, and even just the section on how some people are more internally rotated and some people are more externally rotated in their hips, I was like, oh my God, that explains everything. I'm an internal rotator. Like,
our bones aren't all shaped the same, right?
Exactly. It was like, that's why I'm feeling pinching, because my bones are squishing together, you know?
Yes.
But it was like no one had explained that to me. And so once I watched that and then also had permission to like then change the so-called, I'm doing air quotes that you can't see, alignment of these poses to a way that worked for my body, I was like, oh, this is amazing. And it changed the way I started looking at my students. There was no more these like rigid cues about like where your feet should be in Tadasana or where you're, you know, it was like, oh, okay, well that may not be relevant. So it changed the way I taught and it changed my own practice. And then fast forward to 2007 and it was summertime. I just happened to walk into, of all places, an Ashtanga studio because I was looking for a yoga prop to buy for a gift for somebody. And I was like, oh, they probably don't have bolsters, but let's just go check. And so I was going to go buy a bolster. And as I walked in the door, there was a cork board and there was a picture of Paul Grilly's head on there saying he was doing a yin workshop. I didn't know anything about yin. I had no idea what yin was. I just knew that face. And I was like, oh my God, he's coming. I'm going to that workshop. And so I went, and that was it. It changed everything. Not only, doing more of that study in person with him, with talking about the bones and seeing different bodies. So like that was also, mind blowing, taking it out of DVD and into live, and then also experiencing yin for the first time. Because I came from a super tight, for the most part, super tight body. I mean, I was an ex-bodybuilder and a hairstylist. Like, I had some tight, strong muscles. And that practice gave me a sense of spaciousness that I had never felt before. And also a deeper sense of calm even than what I had experienced in other classes. That's the still and the quiet and the being on the ground and really having the time in those poses was pretty beneficial to me. So then I started practicing yin. So I bought his DVD and all the books and all the things, and started practicing that about 3 times a week, in addition to my now what I would call hatha practice, less Iyengar and more hatha, because I was off the Iyengar train. And it just changed the way I practice. And then I gradually started teaching it, like, for example, because I'm doing a registered series. So if there's a day where I'm sick, I don't have a sub. So guess who's showing up?
If you are hearing this message, then you're listening to the free version of J. Brown Yoga Talks. To hear the rest of our conversation, please subscribe to Podcast Premium at jbrownyoga.com/premium.